let's switch it to all the things that give me hope for the second half. And to be perfectly honest, I've kind of a long list here. I'll begin with Chris Bassitt. All-star. Deserved to be there on the initial selections. Ace of the staff. Stopper. Guy that you want starting if you have to play a wild card game. He's the guy you want starting. If you're going to start right in the ALDS, he's the guy you want game one of whoever else you're going up against. You have that. You have Chris Bassitt. You have a guy that is, the reputation of what happens in his starts, he's either really good and it shows, or he's struggling a bit and he's still good because that's where he's arrived at in his career. Honestly, some of the outings lately where he doesn't have it and he knows it and the opponent knows it and he still gets through it, those are almost as impressive as anything else. I know they're not his favorite, but they are as impressive as everything else. So Chris Bassitt being like the undisputed ace, most consistent starter of this group, no question, something that gives me tremendous hope. And not to overlook a Frankie Montas or a Sean Manaea or hopefully a Luzardo if he can win and if he can come back in the rotation. But two other names that just really pop out to me from this rotation are James Kaprielian and Cole Irvin. Now, Irvin was in the opening day, on the opening day staff because Mike Fiers was out, earned the job, but completely has impressed this year. Not a guy who's going to strike everybody out. Doesn't have the blistering fastball, but he just pitches so well. He's had some of the best A's starting performances of this season. The story of him saying he's pitching with a chip on his shoulder, the way he's done it. And really the same thing with James Kaprielian, who got called up, made the first big league start at Fenway, lights out in that game. He's pitched at Yankee Stadium. He was really good there. He's gone up against some of the toughest opponents, went up against Houston, did really well against them too. Those two guys, as I'm not saying, pitchers that nobody expected or nobody saw coming, that's not fair, that's not accurate. But for them to say, okay, I'm going to take this chance and not only run with it, I'm going to sprint with it. I just think the storylines of those two individuals and the way they've battled this year, and they've had a couple down starts too, don't get me wrong, it hasn't been all perfect. But generally speaking, I ask respectfully, where would this team be without those two starters that a lot of people didn't have on their plans, let's say, midway through the offseason? All right, so Bassitt with Kaprielian and Cole Irvin in different ways, great stories. Let's move on to the position players. Matt Olson, what he's done this year in boosting the average, cutting down the strikeouts all at the same time while continuing to hit home runs and play great defense at first base. That gives me tremendous hope that even a player like Olson has found the ways to make adjustments, improve, and be the Matt Olson that you expect. How could I not mention one Matt without the other? Now, Chapman last year struggled through his final stretch before leaving the season because he needed hip surgery. And even the first, portion of this year, hitting, around or below 200, I think. And it was just not going well for him. And all of a sudden you could just see, you could see how hard he was working on adjustments and timing. And he was a bit late on a lot of fastballs. And he put together a 24-game on-base streak right here before the All-Star break. And he just boosted the average. The fact that Matt Chapman stuck with it like he would, dug himself out of that hole, and is poised and positioned to be an important player in the second half, that gives me a lot of hope. Let's talk about Jed Lowrie, the fountain of youth that he has become. That gives me a lot of hope. Now, I would say his season may have had higher points in May and June than necessarily it did here in the first part of July. But Jed Lowrie, the veteran presence, switch hitter, guy that can, DH a lot of times, stay in your lineup when he gets hot because he can face righties and lefties. Again, who would have expected Jed Lowrie, the guy who signed a minor league contract with this team this past offseason? That's another great story along the lines of Kaprielian and Cole Irvin. Let me also throw in Elvis Andrus. I've got some notes over here, by the way. These aren't even on my notes because I'm just realizing right now I cannot leave out Elvis Andrus, another slow starter this year, but another critical player defensively at shortstop. I know Bob Melvin's been having him hit higher in the order without Canna up there, and you kind of have Laureano leading off, but I actually like when Andrus is at the bottom of the lineup and is hitting well, because that's another guy to help turn you over, to get you back to the top of the lineup. Just adds an incredible amount of length and depth to your 1 through 9. And you heard the reputation. You knew he was going to be a good teammate. He's lived up to all that, always smiling, and now performing to go along with it. Now, another thing that gives me simultaneous hope, but the worry is, when can we see Mark Canha back? Can we see him at full strength? Can we see him doing what he did to start the season? Because something that gives me hope is Mark Canha as a leadoff hitter for this team. What he was able to do out of the gate in taking over this role, one that wasn't expected necessarily by a lot of people of him, but as soon as he started doing it, getting on base, in addition to adding power and a guy who could get hits as well as draw walks, draw pitchers into deep counts. I mean, Mark Canha he's filled the role quite nicely of being a leadoff hitter. I love the fact that that's in his toolbox, that's in his arsenal. That's something that gives me a lot of hope for the A's in the second half. The question is, when and where can we see it, and how long can we see it? And then the last thing I had here in terms of hope, yeah, you can see there was a lot of them. Lou Trivino, the fact that he has settled into the closer role, again, with Trevor Rosenthal being in the mix, then out of the mix, then maybe back in the mix, now completely gone from the conversation. I mean, where would the A's be if they didn't have a Trivino to close out games? You understand, you cannot just put any relief pitcher in that role. There's a certain mentality, there's a certain pitch arsenal, there's a certain prototype that needs to fit for your team as a closer. And if the A's didn't have Trivino, if they didn't have him with the success that he just saw in the month of July, really late June into July, again, I ask, where would they be?